Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Alexander Nevsky, the movie, a moving conflict about Russian history on the steppes, the conflict between the hero of Russia, Alexander Nevsky, and the Teutonic Knights. Here we are in the 21st century, another conflict playing out right now in real time in Kiev, the ancient and very important capital of Ukraine. Professor Steve Cohen here of New York University. Steve was here with us in November before his trip to Russia, warning that this conflict ahead pitted the Russian Federation and the European Union against each other, and Ukraine was divided right in the middle. Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, is a man very much favoring Russia. Suddenly, at the end of the month, December 1st, Yanukovych made a decision. He leans towards Moscow, and now the turmoil. Steve, a very good evening to you. What are the conflicts that we're seeing in the streets of Kiev tonight? Good evening to you.
John, if you wanted to know what's going on in Ukraine tonight, you would never, ever, ever figure it out from reading the American press. Since the end of the Soviet Union, American media coverage of Russia has been so bad that I would say it's worse than it was during the Cold War. One-dimensional, ideological, without any really attempt to understand Russia's side of the story. Here's the basic narrative that we find in the American press today about what's going on in Ukraine. Ukraine has a chance by signing this association agreement with the European Union. It's not a membership agreement. It's an economic association agreement. Ukraine has a chance for democracy and economic prosperity. That's first. Second, this can be only good for Ukraine if it signs it. But, as you pointed out, John, the president of Ukraine, who seemed to indicate he was going to sign it, said he wasn't going to sign it, and according to the narrative, this is because he was bullied by Putin, the president of Russia. All three of those elements of the American narrative are false. If this is about democracy, why is it that we, the United States and Europe, are cheering for crowds in the street to overthrow an elected government in Ukraine, Yanukovych's election, which by all accounts was free and fair? That's not democracy. That's mob rule. That's what we saw in Egypt, and we know where that leads. Secondly, the European Union is not offering Ukraine, which is literally bankrupt, about to go into default, about to bring on a horrible depression upon the Ukrainian people. The European Union is not offering Ukraine any significant money. Ukraine needs about $20 billion in the next 2 months to pay its debts, sovereign and domestic debts. It doesn't have it. It begged the European Union for that money, the International Monetary Fund. It was refused. And to the extent that Europe was prepared to lend the money, and remember, Europe is in economic crisis itself. It has very little money. It would give it only on the condition that the Ukrainian government imposed terrible hardship, austerity, on the Ukrainian people of the kind that we've seen in Greece and Spain, which results in an unemployment rate of 25 and 30%. Finally, Putin's role. Putin did absolutely nothing that you or I would not do if we were the national leader of a country which had a big economic interest in a neighboring country, Ukraine, where, by the way, Russia provides a market for 25% of all of Ukraine's goods and provides Ukraine with about 80% of its energy. What Putin did is he put a very hardball, stick and carrot, economic deal on the table. He told Yanukovych, if you sign with Europe, this is what it's going to cost you economically. If you don't sign with Europe, this is what you'll get from us. Markets, subsidies, discounted energy. That's what all governments do. The United States does that. Germany does that. Governments deal with what they have, with what assets they have. So the story that we're being told in this country is completely false. And finally this, had Ukraine signed this agreement, which would have costed its markets and its energy in Russia, it would have been an economic disaster for Ukraine because, one, Ukrainian goods are not marketable in Europe. Two, Europe was not going to provide a financial package of salvation. And third, can anybody really imagine that Europe was going to open its labor market to migrant Ukrainian workers? That was all myth. What is this really about then, John? In my judgment, this is about the ongoing march of the West, which began with NATO expansion, which continues with missile defense installations on Russia's borders, the ongoing march of the West toward Russia that began with the end of the Soviet Union. This is about geopolitics, not about economics. And it is a profoundly important story, and it may lead, if these crowds in the street get out of control, to very, very, very bad violence and a split of Ukraine, which in effect is really two countries. One leads toward Poland, Sweden, and Lithuania, the other half toward Russia. So this is truly a dramatic moment, and we're not getting the true story from our own media.
The statement from the Secretary of State, John Kerry, tonight, the quote is disgust towards the violence in the street. Catherine Ashton, the European Union's foreign minister, meeting with Yanukovych, President Yanukovych, these last hours. Steve, I take back several years ago, you reported when it was first obvious that the EU and NATO were moving on not only Ukraine, but also Georgia.
Yes.
You underlined that Ukraine was not negotiable for Moscow, for the Kremlin, for Vladimir Putin, who was then prime minister. He had been president, now he's a president again. And not negotiable in that this is a 1,000-year-old history, but also strategically, Russia must have Ukraine. It must have its population, and must have its agriculture, and it must have the opening to the Black Sea ports. All still correct, right? Putin cannot let Ukraine go if there's a choice for him.
In Moscow, I was there for 7 days. I got back on Sunday. There is this view among rather non-political Russians that this is Putin's great test as to whether or not he is a great Russian patriot. To let Ukraine go would be forever the infamy of Putin's leadership. To keep Ukraine, not as a supplicant of Russia, but within this Eurasian economic customs union that Putin wants to create, modeled on the European Union, would be a great patriotic triumph for Putin. As of today, Putin has prevailed, but this story is far from over. It's far from over. But let me ask you a question. You mentioned the Americans in the European, the foreign ministers, Virginia Nuland from the State Department, I think, who were in the streets of Kiev. Let's imagine that we had a dispute between a northern and southern American state over some tariff issue or something. Would we expect to find diplomats from Russia, Sweden, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, France, Spain suddenly descending on the United States to tell the citizens of the South and the citizens of the North what they shouldn't do? It's an absolute outrage that Western diplomats feel themselves free to go into a sovereign country and incite a crowd in the street. Of course, they say there must be a peaceful solution, but their very presence there suggests to them that the power of the West is behind the people in the streets. And you remember where that led to in Georgia in 2008,
right?
When the leader of Georgia thought he could attack a Russian enclave because the United States would back him, and it was a crushing defeat for Georgia. And I think something like that could happen here. This is really a dangerous situation.
And do you see the possibility of tearing Ukraine in half the way we saw Georgia fracture?
You mentioned, John, sorry for interrupting, because you made a very good point, and I want to underline it, that if we stay with the strategic aspect of Ukraine for Russia, where is the base of the Russian fleet? It's in Crimea.
Right.
Where is Crimea? It's in Ukraine.
Black Sea Fleet, yes.
That's right. If Ukraine becomes affiliated with the European Union, then technically Ukraine has to obey the laws of the European Union. It gives up part of its sovereignty. What happens to the Russian fleet?
Sergei Prokofiev writes the music for Sergei Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky. Vladimir Putin is a Russian hero, Alexander Nevsky of the 21st century. Can he allow the Teutonic Knights of the 21st century? I know I'm being fanciful, but Russians are romantic characters and they live their history all the time. Can he allow the Teutonic Knights of the European Union and NATO to come and steal the prize? Steve Cohen, the professor of Russian history at New York University. When we come back, what's in it for the United States? Why the push? Why the word of disgust from John Kerry? I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. You're listening to Prokofiev rallying the Russian forces behind the hero Alexander Nevsky. This movie was released in 1938, right before the conflict that tested Russia once more by the Germans, the Teutonic Knights. It was released in the United States in 1939. All these years later, I listened very carefully to Professor Steve Cohen, who watched this developing in Kiev before the violence in the streets, and said this was a choice that was critical to understand which way Ukraine would go, but also the conflict between Moscow and Western Europe, between Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and President Obama. President Obama's cabinet secretary, Secretary of State John Kerry, using the word disgust tonight. It's quoted, disgust for the violence in the streets of Kiev. Steve, what's in it for the United States? What's the self-interest here of pressing this case?
John, here's the very interesting thing about this episode. Unlike in previous conflicts with Russia, let's say with Georgia in 2008, the United States, if it's played a role, it's been in the shadows. It hasn't played the leading role. Obama has said very little. Kerry has commented only because he's had to. The leading role, oddly enough, has been played by Poland and Sweden. Now, there's a theory about Poland and Sweden trying to draw Ukraine into Europe. By the way, Merkel, who doesn't give German marks to anybody, not Greece or Spain, certainly isn't going to bail out Ukraine, correct?
Correct.
She's been all but quiet. And here's the theory that you hear in Eastern Europe. Poland fears Germany's power. Poland wants a mini empire of its own. Sweden hates Russia for historical reasons. Poland and Sweden have formed an alliance to draw Ukraine not so much into Western Europe, but into their orbit, because Poland has 45 million people. Potentially, it's a real economy, and that a Ukrainian-Polish-Swedish alliance would offset Germany in West European politics. That's just something to think about. But remember, Europe is badly divided, partly because of the economic crisis, partly for political reasons. Now, Obama, maybe because he's got too much on his plate at home, maybe because he doesn't want another crisis, maybe because he's hoping to win that Nobel Prize he was given in Syria and Iran, has pretty much stayed out of this. Remember, for Obama to prevail in Syria, some sort of an agreement without war, to prevail in Iran, some sort of an agreement to end that nuclear weapons program, Obama needs Putin. Putin is the deal maker behind the scenes. Why would he get into a spitting match with Putin over Ukraine when the United States was already burned in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia in 2008? So oddly enough, the United States has kind of stayed out of this. In a general way, it is an American interest if you think it's an American interest to diminish Russia. I don't think that is America's national security interest. So what we've got on the table here is a kind of choice for Washington. They need Putin, particularly regarding Iran and Syria, and maybe the Middle East generally. Do they want to sacrifice that to get deeply involved in this conflict in Ukraine? And they seem to have made a decision not to get deeply involved.
That
seems to be what's going on.
You mentioned Angela Merkel, leader of the Germans, Berlin. Berlin is an important partner for Moscow. Does Berlin have Berlin have an opinion here? And you suggest that Warsaw has a dog in this fight. Is this national enmity between Warsaw and Moscow? Are we seeing it come back, Steve?
We are seeing it come back, but again, remember that Merkel and Putin were fairly close. When you and I began discussing
Germany and Russia work very well together.
And then there was a division, and now there is this issue of Ukraine, but Merkel has not put herself on the front line. Now remember, she just formed a coalition government in Germany with the Social Democrats, who tend to be a bit softer on Russia than the other German parties. So she may be constrained.
All right, let me push Warsaw then. Is Warsaw in a position to make everybody bend to its enmity towards Russia? Is this revenge?
I actually think that though a lot of Poles hate Russia, a lot of Poles don't hate Russia. I mean, they have a lot of cultural affinities. I think that if we were to argue, who is this really about? I think in large measure, as I said before, it's about Poland and Germany.
Do they talk?
Poland fears Germany. It wants allies in the East.
In Moscow, do they talk about Warsaw? Is this about that historical dispute between them? Is this about Putin apologizing for the Katyn Forest massacre?
But look, John, a year ago, it appeared that Putin had carried out a détente with Poland.
Right.
And it appeared that Poland had accepted the apologies and that the anonymity, at least, was reduced. But Poland is a profoundly divided political society as well. And the foreign minister of Poland is very anti-Russian. The 2 or 3 political parties are anti-Russian, others less so. So in each of these countries, there's one point, John, you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, and before we end, we ought to put it on the agenda.
We have a minute. Go ahead, Steve.
Ukraine is 2 countries, politically, culturally, economically. The South and the East are ethnically Russian. And when I say ethnically Russian, half of them are married to Russians.
Right.
They don't speak Ukrainian. Western Ukraine, including Kiev, the capital, are Catholic, not Orthodox, Ukrainian-speaking, and they look toward Lithuania and Poland. So when we look at the split in the country, Western Ukraine wanted Yanukovych to sign this agreement. Eastern Ukraine didn't. What happens if push comes to shove? 2 Ukraines. One becomes a province of Russia, which, by the way, Eastern and Southern Ukrainian people might welcome. And Western Ukraine becomes, I don't know what, an independent country or a province of Poland. I don't know. But Ukraine is, in every empirical sense, 2 countries. It's not really a nation state in the way we think of it. And that's what's really playing out here. And it's terrible that the West is exacerbating the split in
Professor
Ukraine.
Steve Cohen of New York University. Alexander Nevsky, the hero who saved Russia in the 13th century. Will he ride again? I'm John Batchelor.